A pilot snapped a black CEO's finger during a first-class argument, unaware the FAA was monitoring the cockpit feed in real time. What happens next will leave you speechless. You must join our channel and hit subscribe, because only those who believe no black CEO should be physically harmed will do it before this story begins. The moment Jalen Thorne reached seat 1A, the atmosphere shifted. The quiet murmur of boarding passengers and the overhead whir of air vents gave way to a crackling tension that hadn't existed moments before. Standing in the aisle, just inches from his assigned seat, was the pilot himself, Captain Royce Denlin, arms crossed, face hardened like granite, and eyes fixed squarely on Jalen with unmistakable irritation. "That's reserved," Royce said flatly, his voice edged with command rather than courtesy. Jalen paused mid-step, caught off guard by the unusual confrontation. First-class passengers were still settling in, glancing up from newspapers and phones, curious but not yet alarmed. Jalen offered a measured, almost disbelieving nod, as if he hadn't quite heard the pilot correctly. He reached into his coat pocket and retrieved his boarding pass, holding it forward with the calm efficiency of someone used to professionalism. "It says 1A, Jalen replied, keeping his tone even, though his eyes studied the pilot carefully. He was no stranger to power plays, but never from someone in uniform before takeoff. Royce didn't even glance at the pass. His jaw flexed, a subtle twitch near his temple betraying tension beneath the surface. "There's been a mistake in the system," he said, the words delivered like a shutdown order. "That seat isn't available." Jalen held his ground, not moving back but not stepping forward either. "My ticket was purchased directly through your airline," he said. "First class, confirmed. That's my seat." Behind him, the boarding process slowed. One by one, heads turned. Whispers began to ripple through the cabin, phones subtly raised at waist level, the lenses aimed discreetly but purposefully. The moment had already become a spectacle. Royce's hand came up, an impatient, dismissive wave. "You can sit in coach," he said with finality, "or you can leave the plane." A flicker of disbelief crossed Jalen's face. He wasn't new to microaggressions, to veiled attempts at reminding him of some unspoken social hierarchy. But this wasn't veiled. This was loud, public, and meant to humiliate. He glanced briefly at the gold-embossed letters on the boarding pass, then met Royce's eyes again. This wasn't a mistake. This was a message. A junior flight attendant, barely older than 20, with a name tag that read Chris, stepped forward hesitantly, eyes darting between the two men. "Captain Denlin, sir. The manifest, he really is." Chris stopped when Royce shot him a sharp look. The young man froze, then took a step back, murmuring, "Sorry," and disappeared behind the curtain separating first class from the galley. Jalen's throat tightened, not with fear, but with fury held on a tight leash. He thought of the summit he was flying to, the defense contracts, the hours of preparation, the stakes tied to every word he would present once he landed. But now, all of that had been reduced to a power struggle over a seat. Or maybe, more truthfully, over who was deemed acceptable to occupy it. "I'm sitting here," Jalen said quietly but with unwavering clarity. "Now please step aside." Royce didn't move. The pilot's face had gone cold, his eyes scanning Jalen like he was a problem to be managed, not a passenger to be respected. He stepped forward slightly, enough to invade Jalen's personal space. The divide between them was narrow now, charged with something unspoken but deeply understood. The air in the cabin grew tighter. A man across the aisle shifted uncomfortably, his brow furrowed. 2 seats back, a passenger started recording openly, no longer pretending to scroll. Every second of silence felt loaded, ready to snap. But Jalen didn't blink. He stood tall, leather folder still clutched in one hand, his frame tense but rooted. For a moment, neither man moved. It wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about visibility, power, and the battle for respect in spaces that too often refused to offer it. Somewhere, a child's voice called out from the back, asking what was taking so long. But in the front cabin, time had compressed to a fragile thread between confrontation and consequence. And then, in the smallest of gestures, Royce's subtle clench of the fist at his side, Jalen saw the escalation coming. He saw it before it happened, but he didn't retreat. The situation was escalating quickly, and no one expected what would happen next. The conflict began with a seat, but it wouldn't end there. "I don't care what your ticket says," Royce growled, his voice sharp and final as he stepped forward, blocking Jalen's path with the full weight of his authority. His jaw was clenched, his narrowed eyes radiating something deeper than protocol, something personal. The overhead lights in the cabin buzzed faintly, illuminating the tension between the two men like a spotlight on a stage. The murmurs of passengers intensified as a few raised their phones, quietly beginning to record. Jalen Thorne didn't flinch at first. His grip tightened slightly on the leather briefing folder tucked beneath his arm. His expression, composed but firm, held the kind of resolve born not just from confidence, but from a lifetime of enduring slights masked as rules. He glanced briefly at the seat, 1A, just a few feet away. It was his. It had always been his. But Royce was still in front of him, unmoving, an immovable object trying to become a gatekeeper. "I'm taking my seat," Jalen said, voice calm but layered with warning. Royce's mouth twisted in disdain. "You can sit in coach," he said, almost spitting the word, "or you can leave." The sentence landed like a slap across the cabin. A few heads turned. Someone gasped. Others stayed frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing an internal airline matter or something more personal. Jalen felt heat creep up the back of his neck, not from fear, but from humiliation. He took a step forward, not aggressively, but decisively. That was enough. Without a word, Royce's hand shot forward. In one violent, calculated motion, he seized Jalen's right hand and snapped the ring and pinky fingers backward with a swift, brutal twist. The sound was unmistakable, a sharp, sickening crack that echoed down the aisle like the snapping of dry wood. Jalen let out a raw, involuntary cry of pain as he dropped to one knee. The briefing folder fell to the floor, papers scattered across the polished cabin floor like leaves in the wind. Gasps erupted all around him. The cabin descended into stunned silence for a moment, broken only by the dull whir of the overhead fans and Jalen's heavy, ragged breathing. A steward froze near the galley, eyes wide. The junior flight attendant, no older than 25, stood helpless near the exit row, his lips parted, his face pale. Jalen clutched his injured hand close to his chest, his face contorted in pain. A sharp throb radiated from his fingers up through his wrist and into his arm, but even through the pain, something stronger pulsed beneath it. Shame. Not because he had fallen, but because he knew Royce had wanted exactly that, to reduce him, to show dominance. And it had happened in front of a plane full of strangers, with cameras rolling, with eyes wide and mouths silent. From the back of the plane, a man suddenly stood, middle-aged, dark-skinned, wearing a navy sweatshirt and jeans. Lionel Kerr. He had been seated in economy, but he now stepped into the aisle, his voice cutting through the stunned quiet. "That's assault," Lionel shouted, pointing directly at Royce. His voice trembled, not from fear, but fury. "You just assaulted him." Royce didn't respond. His face was blank, unreadable, but his hand hovered near his belt, trembling ever so slightly. The moment hung suspended in the air, too fragile to move, too volatile to speak. Then, ding. A soft chime rang out overhead. Everyone looked up. For a second, no one understood its meaning. The sound was innocuous, routine, like a seatbelt reminder. But inside the cockpit, behind a sealed door, a silent feed had been playing. What no one on board could have known was that the Federal Aeronautic Bureau had activated a surprise compliance audit that day. The onboard camera in the cockpit, typically dormant except for training footage, had been accessed remotely for a randomized review of crew behavior and protocol. What Royce didn't know, what no one had planned for, was that the Bureau had tapped into that feed before the altercation began. Not after. Every word, every motion, every calculated twist of the wrist had already been seen. And not just recorded, monitored live. On screen, in an unassuming gray building miles away, a silent image displayed Jalen Thorne on his knees, clutching his hand, and a uniformed pilot standing over him like a stone pillar. Federal officials, sipping their coffee, had stood up mid-sip. What they had seen wasn't just a breach of protocol, it was violence in uniform. And it had happened not in private, not in secret, but beneath the high ceilings and narrow aisles of a commercial flight full of passengers. Back in the cabin, Jalen slowly stood, breath shallow, pain flaring behind his eyes. His legs trembled, not from weakness but from restraint. He didn't scream. He didn't lash out. He looked around, locking eyes with Lionel, who nodded once, silent confirmation that someone had seen him, that someone believed him. Across the cabin, Royce stepped back toward the cockpit door, a flicker of uncertainty flashing across his face for the first time. Something in the air had changed. The phones were still recording. Whispers were growing louder. The junior flight attendant looked from Jalen to Royce, then back again, sweat beading on his brow. In that quiet moment, above 30,000 feet, a battle had begun, and somewhere in a dimly lit operations room, someone pressed a red button, alerting ground control. The pilot thought no one saw, but the sky had eyes. The wheels hadn't even cooled on the tarmac when the plane jerked back into position at the gate. The intercom buzzed with awkward static. Cabin lights flickered on, illuminating a cabin filled with whispers and shifting glances. Royce Denlin, face flushed and jaw clenched, barked orders to the co-pilot without making eye contact. His voice had lost its earlier arrogance and now rang with forced authority. "Run, post-landing checks. Do not speak to anyone. I'll handle the terminal." Without waiting for a reply, he ripped off his pilot's badge, stuffed it into his pocket, and stormed off the aircraft. The moment the hatch hissed open, Royce vanished into the terminal like a shadow slipping between cracks just as reporters began to trickle into view beyond the glass. Inside the cabin, the scene was frozen in uneasy silence. Then came movement. 2 paramedics, summoned by ground control, boarded swiftly, pushing a stretcher between the rows. Jalen Thorne sat hunched in his seat, his charcoal suit jacket draped over one shoulder. His left hand cradled against his chest, fingers bent unnaturally, ring and pinky already purpling with bruised swelling. Sweat clung to his temples despite the air conditioning, but his expression was calm, focused. As the medics approached, Jalen looked up, eyes steady. "Let's make it quick," he muttered, his voice low but measured. One of the paramedics, a young man with wide eyes, hesitated before nodding. "We'll be gentle, sir," he said, kneeling beside the seat. "Can you tell me your level of pain on a scale?" "Not important," Jalen cut in. "Just get me out before the cameras show up." The cabin doors had barely shut behind the stretcher when flashes erupted outside. Reporters pressed against the terminal windows, shouting questions muffled by thick glass. "Is it true the pilot attacked him? Was this racially motivated?" The questions swirled like a growing storm, but Jalen kept his gaze forward, silent. In the ambulance, the city raced by in a blur. Sirens wove through traffic, but Jalen's mind was louder. He didn't replay the pain, he replayed the stare Royce had given him before twisting his fingers. That cold dismissal, that unspoken statement, "You don't belong here." But Jalen knew better. He wasn't just someone who sat in first class, he was a man who earned it. The injury wasn't what stung, it was the insult buried in that moment. The message Royce tried to send. And Jalen wasn't about to let that message go unchallenged. The hospital was a blur of antiseptic lights, cool metal, and curt voices. X-rays confirmed both fingers were fractured at the joints. A clear break, clean and sharp. A plastic brace was molded around his hand, wrapping up to his forearm. The attending physician asked if he wanted painkillers. Jalen shook his head. "Pain reminds me I'm still fighting," he replied flatly. The doctor gave a hesitant nod, unsure how to respond. An hour later, as nurses checked monitors and adjusted IV lines, the curtain was pulled aside. A man stepped in, dressed in a dark gray suit, with a silver badge clipped to his belt. His expression was unreadable, but his presence was immediate. He introduced himself with a nod. "Agent Thomas Vale, Federal Aeronautic Bureau." Jalen looked at him carefully. "I'm assuming this isn't a wellness check." "No, Mr. Thorne," Vale replied, stepping closer. "This is formal. Internal feeds from the cabin and cockpit were active during your flight. The Bureau had tapped into them for a random compliance audit." His tone was calm, but there was weight behind it. "What happened to you wasn't just misconduct. It was recorded assault." Jalen sat back, tension tightening across his shoulders. "So, you saw it?" "I didn't just see it," Vale said, pulling out a slim tablet and tapping the screen. "It's mirrored on 3 secure servers. Royce's actions, and his attempt to assert authority beyond protocol, are documented." For the first time since boarding the flight, Jalen let out a quiet exhale. Not relief, but confirmation. "Then I don't just have a case," he said. "I have proof." Vale nodded. "And the Bureau will cooperate if you choose to press charges." Jalen's eyes narrowed. "I'm not just pressing charges. I'm making this public." Agent Vale paused, watching him. "This won't be easy. The airline has a lot of influence. They'll try to bury this, or twist it." Jalen's voice was like steel. "Let them try." By the time Jalen was discharged the next morning, news had already broken. Skybridge Air released a sanitized statement. Skybridge deeply regrets an unfortunate misunderstanding involving a passenger and crew member. We are cooperating with federal authorities as a standard procedure. There was no apology, no accountability, just carefully chosen language that blamed no one and said nothing. Back at his penthouse office in downtown Rensfield, Jalen sat in silence, a soft brace on his hand, his phone buzzing every few minutes. His assistant, Malcolm, stood nearby, pale and shaken. "The phones haven't stopped, sir. Reporters, senators, 3 advocacy groups, and the mayor." Jalen turned to him. "Start compiling a legal team. I want someone who's handled civil rights, federal transport, and PR warfare, and make sure we archive every message." "Yes, sir." Jalen turned toward the window, the city skyline stretching into gray-blue dusk. His fingers ached, but his vision was clear. This wasn't just about him. It never was. It was about every time someone like him had been told they didn't belong, every time silence had followed injustice. He picked up a voice recorder and spoke clearly. "Royce Denlin used force to enforce a prejudice." Skybridge Air protected him with silence. "They want to bury this, but I'm going to plant it like a flag." He clicked the recorder off. He didn't just want compensation, he wanted consequences. The first crack came quietly, behind closed doors. Within hours of the cabin incident, Skybridge Air scrambled into crisis mode. Royce Denlin had been placed on administrative leave, a technicality that came with no public announcement. Internally, however, the company's legal department worked swiftly, securing private counsel for Royce and crafting a carefully worded statement labeling the event a heated miscommunication. Their intent was clear: stall the narrative, cloud the facts, and protect the airline's image. But what they didn't account for was that the man they had assaulted was not only a powerful CEO, but a strategist who had built empires on transparency and structure. Jalen Thorne sat in a dimly lit recovery room, his left hand bound in a brace and elevated on a pillow. The bruising was worse than he expected, deep purples and yellows creeping across his knuckles, the swelling making his fingers unrecognizable. Still, he didn't wince. His focus was elsewhere. His assistant had just delivered a report. 2 internal memos had been leaked anonymously from Skybridge's legal department. He read them in silence, the sterile air around him growing heavier with each line. Royce Denlin's legal fees were being quietly covered by the airline. And worse, this wasn't Royce's first offense. 3 prior complaints, all from minority passengers, all quietly dismissed. Jalen looked up, jaw clenched, the edges of his vision tinged with a cold clarity. "They knew," he said aloud, mostly to himself. "They knew, and they let it happen again." His lead attorney, Orion Graves, stood across the room, arms crossed, eyes narrowed at the document spread out before him. "They buried it," Orion said quietly, voice low with restrained fury. "And now they're hoping this will fade like the others. But they made a mistake this time." Jalen's expression didn't change, because this time it was recorded. It was then that Agent Tomas Vale from the Federal Aeronautic Bureau entered the room. His arrival was silent, but his presence filled the space with a kind of gravity that turned heads. A plain, black suit, pressed shirt, no tie. He didn't sit, just stood at the edge of the bed, his hands clasped in front of him like a man about to deliver a verdict. "Mr. Thorne," Vale said, his voice even, measured, "I need to inform you of something sensitive. During the flight, Captain Denlin attempted to override the cabin recording system. He accessed the cockpit override and tried to delete the internal feed." Jalen's good hand curled into a fist. "Did he succeed?" Vale shook his head once. Number. What Denlin didn't know is that the FAB has been running a mirrored backup system on select flights. The entire feed was transmitted to an off-site server in real time. His attempt to delete it qualifies as tampering with federal property. There was a pause. Then, slowly, Jalen leaned forward in the bed. "So, he didn't just attack me," he said, his voice low and calm. "He tried to erase the evidence." "Correct," Vale replied, "and that attempt may carry heavier penalties than the assault itself." The room went quiet. Orion stepped forward, picking up a notepad already outlining a strategy. "We'll need full access to cockpit logs, training histories, all personnel files, every documented incident Denlin was involved in." Vale nodded. "You'll have it." Later that evening, Jalen agreed to give a single interview to a respected news outlet. The lighting was subdued, his suit clean but his left hand braced and elevated. Across from him sat a host who looked more nervous than he did. Cameras rolled. Questions came. And when the host asked what this incident truly meant to him, not just as a businessman but as a black man in America, Jalen's voice didn't falter. "This isn't about a seat," he said, locking eyes with the camera. "It's about power and how some people think they still get to choose who sits where." The video aired within the hour. By morning, it had gone viral. News anchors replayed it. Social media quoted it. Protesters printed the words on signs. For many, it wasn't just a statement, it was a mirror. Meanwhile, somewhere far from the cameras, Royce Denlin sat alone in a rented townhouse outside the city. He hadn't answered his phone in days. His lawyer, paid by Skybridge, kept urging him to stay silent. But Royce's hands shook when he saw Jalen's face on every screen. He'd assumed the incident would blow over, that the airline would spin it, that the recording had been wiped. He never imagined the footage still existed. He never imagined Jalen would fight back. His confidence, once unshakable, now cracked with dread, because he knew, deep down, that everything was about to collapse, and this time the silence wouldn't protect him. When you strike the wrong man, his silence becomes your reckoning. The message arrived at Orion Graves' encrypted line just past midnight. No name, no sender ID. Just one sentence. "I kept the files. Royce wanted them gone." At first, Orion thought it might be a prank or one of the countless anonymous tips that led nowhere, but the attachment below it, a folder titled Flight Logs RD Internal, shifted his posture instantly. He sat upright in the dim light of his home office, the glow of the screen washing across his face as he opened the files with practiced caution. Inside were flight incident reports, official logs Royce Denlin had filed over the past 5 years, but these weren't just complaints. They were fabrications, dressed in bureaucratic language, quietly weaponized to justify misconduct. Passenger names, including at least 3 black men and 1 Middle Eastern entrepreneur, appeared again and again, flagged under terms like belligerent, non-compliant, and possible intoxication. And then Orion found it. A report from Flight B-247, the one that had left Jalen with 2 broken fingers and a nation in shock. In Royce's words, Passenger Thorne displayed erratic behavior prior to boarding. He was verbally combative, refused direct orders, and appeared under the influence of an unknown substance. A fabricated narrative, preemptive damage control, filed after the flight had landed. The timestamp didn't lie. Orion immediately forwarded the packet to Jalen's secure line. Within the hour, the 2 men met at a private conference room in Graves' firm. The room was dark except for a single overhead light illuminating the table, the folder, and the weight of the truth it carried. "He used a fake ID," Orion said, sliding over a printout of the alias Royce had used to submit post-flight complaints. J.D. Keller, a phantom employee. But the language? It's Royce. It's always been him. Jalen stared at the papers, jaw tight. The brace on his hand was gone now, but the stiffness remained, fingers he could no longer curl fully. His silence was not from shock but from fury under control. "He wrote this after breaking my hand," Jalen said quietly. "He was already planning the lie." Orion nodded. "And there's more." He tapped a second file. An audio clip played, faint but clear enough. A voice, unmistakably Royce's, spoke in a low murmur. "I don't care if they complain. I file my version first. The system believes the uniform." The room chilled. Outside the windows, the city pulsed with quiet light, unaware that inside this room, a case was transforming from personal assault to something far more systemic. Jalen leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice steady. "Who gave this to you?" Orion hesitated. Then, "A technician. Emmerich Dole. Young. Works nights. Said someone ordered him to wipe Royce's record clean before the FAA audit. He refused. Kept digital copies of everything. He's afraid." Jalen's eyes narrowed. "Will he testify?" "He's willing, but only under protection. He knows what this means." Jalen sat back, nodding slowly. "We protect him, no matter what." In the following days, Orion's team worked quickly. Emmerich was brought in under confidentiality, his identity shielded from the media. A quiet, wiry man with nervous energy and sharp eyes, Emmerich wore the face of someone who had seen too much and said too little for too long. "I didn't want to get involved," he told Orion during a prep session, "but when they asked me to erase the logs, I knew it wasn't about data, it was about hiding something rotten. I made copies, backups. I didn't know if I'd ever need them. But when I saw what happened to Mr. Thorne, he trailed off, voice catching. I couldn't pretend anymore. The documents Emmerich provided filled in every gap. Royce had constructed a digital trail of excuses, false reports, redacted complaints, altered timestamps. With these files, Jalen's legal team had more than just a narrative. They had evidence. Solid, verifiable, damning. Meanwhile, word of the trial spread. Support for Jalen surged. Tech executives, civil rights groups, business leaders, men who had once shaken his hand in boardrooms now raised their voices in defense. Statements poured in, articles were published, and editorials demanded answers from Skybridge Air. But the company responded in silence until it didn't. Late one evening, Orion received a call from a blocked number. A calm, corporate voice offered a settlement. A public apology, a generous compensation package, and a confidentiality clause. Jalen didn't even blink when Orion relayed the offer. "No," he said, "this isn't about money. This is about truth." But behind the scenes, more pieces were moving. Unbeknownst to both the airline and Royce, a second federal division had quietly opened its own file on Flight B247. Orion caught wind of it when a redacted memo arrived from an unknown source, stamped with the crest of the Office of Federal Integrity. "What's this?" Jalen asked, scanning the document. Orion looked at him gravely. Proof that the FAA wasn't the only agency watching. There had been another observer on the flight. Not for Royce, not for Skybridge. For you, Jalen. Jalen's pulse quickened. "Why?" "I don't know yet," Orion replied, "but something tells me they were watching long before Royce ever stepped into that aisle." Jalen turned back to the window, gazing out at the traffic lights blinking below. The city moved as if untouched by the storm building above it. He exhaled slowly. Then, let them watch. The moment wasn't just legal, it was cinematic. It was a man refusing to bend, even when the world tried to twist him into something small. And far above them, in federal offices and surveillance rooms and sealed court records, a different story was forming, one of corruption, of silence, of someone finally breaking through both. The courtroom would be next. But for now, Jalen stared at the horizon, not just as a man seeking justice, but as a symbol of something larger. And what Royce didn't know? The FAA wasn't the only agency watching. Another set of eyes had been on that flight for a different reason entirely. Justice had already boarded the plane, it just hadn't taken off yet. The document arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope, no return address, no agency seal. Orion Graves received it at his law firm's private mailbox 2 weeks before trial. Inside, clipped together with a red paper fastener, were 37 pages of dense, heavily redacted federal correspondence. What caught his eye wasn't the letterhead, it was the handwritten note scribbled at the bottom of the cover page in faint graphite. "You didn't find this. It found you." Later that evening, inside Jalen Thorne's quiet study, the room dimly lit by a single desk lamp, Orion laid the documents out in front of him. Jalen's hand, still wrapped in a brace, rested on the leather arm of his chair. His face was calm, but his eyes flicked sharply over the redacted text, narrowing with each line. "This isn't surveillance," Jalen said, voice low. "This is a test." Orion nodded slowly. "Not just from the FAA. These pages mention a division called the Office of Federal Integrity. Ever heard of them?" "No," Jalen replied, sitting up straighter. "And I've worked in tech policy for 15 years. They're off-book, internal clearance structure. No website, no agency footprint," Orion explained, tapping a passage. "They've been monitoring high-level contractors for patterns, ethical responses, crisis management, conduct under fire, and they've been watching you ever since Kaimark submitted that aerial encryption bid last quarter." Jalen felt his throat tighten. He leaned back, exhaling slowly, staring past the edge of his desk to the dark window beyond. The city blinked in silence. "So, that camera feed, Royce breaking my hand, it didn't just go to the FAA?" "No," Orion confirmed. "It was mirrored. Your reaction, your tone, your interviews, everything. They were watching how you'd respond to injustice, not as a victim, as a potential federal partner." A silence hung between them, thick and profound. Jalen stood, pacing slowly. The implications swirled through his mind. It wasn't just about Royce anymore, or Skybridge's silence, or the courtroom showdown. His behavior in crisis had become part of a silent evaluation, a measuring stick for trust, responsibility, and federal alignment. He wasn't being judged as a man wronged, but as a man being tested. "What happens now?" Jalen asked, his voice low. "We move forward," Orion said, but with eyes wide open. That night, Jalen couldn't sleep. He replayed the flight again and again in his mind, not just the moment his fingers snapped under Royce's hand, but the moments after. How he'd stood firm, how he'd refused the hush money, how he'd spoken calmly on national television when it would have been easier to rage. Had all of it been seen? Not by the public, but by agencies weighing his character in silence? By morning, the path ahead became clear. Inside a conference room at Kaimark's headquarters, Jalen met with his inner circle, senior engineers, legal counsel, ethics advisors. He outlined a new initiative, not a reactive one, a proactive one. "We need to address the roots of this," he told them, voice steady. "This wasn't an accident. It was a pattern waiting to be caught. We're launching something new, the Skygate Initiative." The room fell quiet. Skygate will be a watchdog task force. We'll build frameworks for airline accountability, real-time ethics reporting, flight crew behavioral audits. We'll set the standard. One of the engineers frowned. "Is that wise? Right before a federal bid?" "That's exactly why it's necessary," Jalen replied, locking eyes with him. "If we don't build the standard, someone else will. And I know now, they're already watching who's ready to lead." Across the table, no one spoke. Then, one by one, heads nodded. The next week was a blur of whiteboards, planning sessions, encrypted message threads, and press statements. Jalen's legal battle pressed forward, but now, so did something larger, something structured. The Skygate Initiative launched publicly with backing from a civil aviation ethics firm and a coalition of concerned tech leaders. The message was clear: no more silence at 30,000 feet. Agent Tomas Vale returned that Friday, requesting a private meeting. They sat across from each other in the same sterile government room where Vale had first confirmed the FAA footage weeks ago. This time, Jalen didn't flinch. He didn't fidget. He simply waited. Vale slid a folder across the table. "Unofficially," he said, "you should know. The Office of Federal Integrity's file on you has been marked exceeds expectations." Jalen gave a quiet nod, but his jaw was tight. "And the feed?" "Still archived," Vale said. "Untouched. But it was watched by more than just one agency. This goes higher than most realize." Jalen closed the folder. "Then let them keep watching. I'm not the one hiding." Vale studied him for a long moment, then rose. "You understand what's at stake now." Jalen stood too. "I've understood since the moment my hand hit that tray table." As the door closed behind Vale, Jalen felt no satisfaction, only clarity. The trial would still happen. Royce would still face the consequences. But now there was a broader audience, silent, powerful, and waiting to see if justice could birth more than punishment. Could it create change? Back in his office, he stood before a wide window overlooking the city. The sky was overcast, the clouds thick like smoke over steel. His hand throbbed as he clenched it, not from the injury but from the weight it now carried. What had started as a personal battle had become a platform, and the sky, once hostile, was now watching with intent. The plane had landed, but the consequences were just beginning to take flight. The screen flickered to life. No introduction, no opening remarks, just a cold, silent video feed projected onto the courtroom wall. Royce Denlin's hand moved with cruel precision, grabbing Jalen Thorne's outstretched arm and wrenching his fingers back with such force that the entire courtroom jolted as the sound of the brake played over the speakers. The footage had no commentary, no enhancements, only the raw security feed captured from the FAA-monitored cabin cam. The snap of bone echoed louder than any gavel. Gasps rippled through the room. One juror instinctively covered his mouth, another leaned forward, elbows pressed against the polished wood of the jury box. Royce's attorney, Everett Menz, was already halfway to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. We believe this footage has been altered." "Sit down," the judge said evenly, not taking his eyes off the screen. "You'll have your turn." At the defense table, Royce shifted uncomfortably, his initial calm giving way to a twitch in his jaw. His eyes darted between the footage and the jury, then to Jalen, who sat across the aisle with a brace still hugging his recovering hand. Jalen hadn't flinched once during the playback. He sat straight, composed, his posture quiet but unshakable. The pain in his fingers may have dulled, but the memory had only sharpened. The video ended. Silence hung in the room like fog. Then Orion Graves rose. "I call Agent Thomas Vale to the stand." A murmur rippled across the gallery. Vale, tall, clean-shaven, dressed in a gray federal blazer, walked to the witness box with the stillness of someone who had seen too much and trusted too little. He swore in, adjusted the microphone, and waited. "Agent Vale," Orion began, voice steady, "can you confirm for the court whether the footage we just witnessed is authentic?" "Absolutely," Vale said, his voice clear. "It was mirrored to an off-site federal server before anyone on that flight even landed. The original file's timestamp, data integrity, and camera feed alignment are all intact. What you saw was the unedited truth." Royce's lawyer interjected again, pressing the claim of bias, but Vale didn't flinch. "We didn't even know Mr. Thorne was on board at first," he said, eyes trained on Royce. "The audit was random, Federal Compliance Review of Flight Conduct. That's what caught it." Jalen watched as Royce's posture slumped slightly in his chair. The confidence he had walked in with, navy suit crisp, shoulders squared, was fading fast. Orion wasn't done. "I now call Emmerich Dole to the stand." If Royce had held on to hope until now, it began to fracture the moment Emmerich entered. Thin, pale, with nervous energy radiating from his hands, Emmerich clutched a folder like it was armor. He looked no older than 26, but wore the expression of someone who had aged fast in a place that demanded silence. After the oath, Orion stepped forward. "Mr. Dole, you contacted my office with concerns about flight crew record-keeping. Can you tell the court what you discovered?" Emmerich swallowed hard. "I was asked to scrub Captain Denlin's file prior to an internal audit. I didn't." He opened the folder, revealing printed emails and logs. "I found multiple incident reports filed by Captain Denlin, post-flight, using an internal alias. The passengers described were all people of color. The language in those reports, it painted them as belligerent, threatening, but none of those incidents were logged during the actual flights." Orion approached the bench, handing a copy to the judge and jury. "Were those falsified?" he asked. "Yes," Emmerich said, voice trembling. "Fabricated to cover his conduct." Gasps again. Royce's lawyer turned red, scrambling through his own paperwork. Royce, meanwhile, now stared at the floor, his hands clenched. For the first time, his body betrayed him. The courtroom saw it. Guilt didn't always speak, but it always showed. Orion leaned closer to the witness. "Were you ever threatened?" "Yes," Emmerich said softly. "Captain Denlin told me if I didn't cooperate, I'd be out of the sky before I even cleared the runway." The gallery murmured again. Reporters scribbled furiously. Outside, news vans began filing urgent updates, and social media lit up like wildfire. Inside the court, Jalen sat still, but his eyes burned, not with rage, but with truth. As Emmerich stepped down, Orion addressed the court. "We rest, Your Honor." Judge Langley nodded. "Defense will have its turn tomorrow." As people began to shuffle, a reporter's voice carried faintly through the open rear door. "Skybridge Air declines comment." Moments later, a second voice added, "New leak suggests company may cut ties with Denlin post-verdict." Royce heard it. His head snapped toward the sound, then back to Orion, who simply met his stare with cold finality. What Royce didn't know until that moment, Skybridge had already begun distancing itself. An internal memo was leaked showing the airline's intent to terminate his contract if he lost. Royce's smirk began to fade. The walls he built around himself were now crumbling from within. If that moment made your blood boil and your heart ache, don't stay silent. Subscribe and become a member, because standing against abuse is how we reclaim dignity. "Play the footage," the prosecutor said with steady resolve, gesturing toward the technician near the courtroom screen. A low hum filled the air as the video came to life, grainy, handheld, and quiet at first. Everyone leaned forward instinctively. The image was shaky, tilted slightly, showing the front cabin from an angle no one had seen before. The courtroom, moments ago buzzing with legal sparring, fell into absolute stillness. The audio crackled, and then, clear as glass, a voice, low and dismissive, broke through. "These people always want more than they paid for." It was Royce Denlin's voice, a single sentence, spoken under his breath but preserved forever by Lionel Kerr's phone. The words hit the room like a punch to the gut. Several jurors flinched, their eyes darting toward the defense table where Royce sat, jaw tight, shoulders slowly curling inward like a man beginning to grasp the gravity of his downfall. The prosecution let the silence stretch just long enough to let the words settle like dust in the lungs. Judge Halbrin adjusted his glasses. "Is that the defendant's voice?" he asked. The technician nodded. "Confirmed, Your Honor. Audio enhancements match the voice print with previous recordings. No alterations." Royce's lawyer stood abruptly. "Objection. This evidence was not disclosed during discovery." "It was recovered by a private citizen, Your Honor," the prosecutor interrupted. "Mr. Kerr stepped forward only this morning after locating the footage on a backup device. He was cleared and vetted through proper channels. We received judicial approval to submit." The judge raised a hand. "Objection overruled. The footage stays." Royce's attorney exhaled sharply, visibly shaken for the first time since the trial began. Meanwhile, Jalen sat composed at the plaintiff's table, eyes fixed on the screen, his hand still braced, fingers curled tightly against the phantom ache. But there was something in his gaze, a quiet, controlled fury held behind years of practiced dignity. The words weren't new to him. What was new was hearing them aloud, in front of 12 jurors, in a room wired for judgment. Lionel Kerr, seated in the witness box, swallowed hard before continuing. "I didn't know I still had the footage," he said, voice cracking slightly. "It was saved to my cloud. I didn't step up before because I thought the official footage would be enough. But then I saw the way they were twisting everything. I knew I had to speak." He looked directly at Jalen. "Nobody deserves to be treated like that. Not ever." A wave of murmurs rippled across the courtroom gallery. Journalists scribbled in notebooks. Cameras outside the building caught glimpses of guards stepping forward, sensing the story peaking in real time. On social media, live stream updates poured in, thousands reacting in real time. Jalen leaned slightly toward his lawyer, Orion Graves. "This is it," he whispered. Graves nodded, then stood. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, we'd like to close our argument by presenting one final clip. It is pulled directly from the mirrored FAA server, and it shows the defendant attempting to erase the flight footage from the cockpit console." Judge Halbrin gestured for them to proceed. "Let's see it." The screen changed again. This time the footage was clean and fixed, taken from a black and white angle behind the cockpit seat. It showed Royce entering alone, scanning the cabin nervously, then reaching into the console. His fingers moved rapidly, flipping toggles, entering codes. The audio synced perfectly. "Delete cabin feed. Confirm override. Manual log off." A pause. Then a red light blinked. System failure. The camera caught Royce's face, furious, confused, and suddenly afraid. He slammed his hand on the console. Gasps filled the room again. There was no denying it now. Physical assault, false reports, deletion attempts, and now, clear evidence of racial bias. Royce's lawyer attempted one last rebuttal. "Your Honor, we ask the jury to focus on context. A single sentence doesn't—" "Save it for closing," the judge cut in flatly, eyes unblinking. "Let the record show the evidence is admitted. The jury will interpret it as they see fit." From his seat, Royce looked around as if realizing for the first time that there was no escape route left. No shield, no narrative. Just consequences. Jalen did not smile. He did not lean back triumphantly or celebrate. He merely breathed, slowly, deeply, as if letting something long held inside finally settle. His voice never raised, but his presence filled the room. Across from him, Royce no longer held his usual smug posture. His hands fidgeted with a pen that no longer worked. His gaze dropped to the table in front of him, unmoving. The prosecution gave no flourish, no dramatic speech. They didn't need to. The footage, the voice, the attempt to erase, each piece spoke for itself. The truth, undeniable and clear, now lived in the courtroom, and with one final nod from Orion, the trial shifted toward its final chapter. Jalen sat still, the echo of the phrase looping in his mind not with pain, but with purpose. What once humiliated, now ignited. The truth had spoken, and it echoed louder than any punch. The jury had been out for only 6 hours, but to Jalen Thorne, it felt like 6 lifetimes. Inside the courtroom, the air hung thick with unspoken tension, like a storm cloud waiting to burst. No one moved, no one whispered. Cameras outside captured every flicker of movement from the gallery, every tightening jaw and nervous glance. The clerk re-entered with a sealed envelope, and in that instant, the world held its breath. "All rise," the bailiff said, voice steady but tight. Jalen stood slowly, his right hand still bandaged, the brace just barely visible beneath the sleeve of his dark navy suit. His eyes didn't drift toward Royce Denlin, who sat 2 tables away with hunched shoulders and hollowed cheeks. The once defiant pilot now looked like a man caught in a storm of his own making, his gaze darting between his lawyer and the floor. The foreman of the jury, a middle-aged man in a slate-gray jacket, cleared his throat and unfolded the verdict sheet. "In the matter of the state versus Royce Denlin, we, the jury, find the defendant guilty of assault in the 2nd degree, guilty of falsification of federal flight records, guilty of obstruction of a federal investigation." A collective exhale rippled across the courtroom, but Jalen didn't flinch. He remained still, eyes fixed forward, expression unreadable. Royce's attorney closed his eyes. Royce himself sank into his chair, hands trembling against the wooden edge of the defense table. There was no outburst, no last-minute plea for sympathy, just silence. Heavy, crushing silence. Outside the courthouse, the impact was immediate. Skybridge Air's stock nosedived within the hour. Investors began pulling out in rapid succession, issuing scathing public statements about the need for a culture reset. The company's boardroom scrambled, but the damage had already been done. What began as a seat dispute had evolved into a public reckoning. Back inside, Jalen's legal team, led by civil rights attorney Orion Graves, offered quiet nods and brief handshakes. Reporters pressed against the glass doors outside like a wave ready to crash. Jalen turned to Orion, speaking low. "No statements inside. Not here." Orion nodded once. "You sure you're ready?" Jalen didn't answer. He simply adjusted his jacket and moved toward the hallway, the limp in his step still present but dignified. As he stepped into the harsh light of the press corridor, camera flashes erupted like lightning. A cluster of microphones rose toward him like thorns. He stopped at the podium set just beyond the courthouse steps. The crowd buzzed with anticipation. Behind him stood members of his legal team, silent and solemn. To his left, Agent Thomas Vale of the Federal Aeronautic Bureau stood in uniform, watching with arms crossed. To his right, Lionel Kerr, whose brave in-flight outcry and hidden footage had cracked the case open, stood with quiet composure, his hand clutching a medal he'd received just hours before from the Office of Civic Ethics. Jalen leaned toward the mic. The world went quiet. "This was never about a seat," he said, voice calm, steady. "This was about who gets to sit with dignity and who thinks they can deny it." He stepped back without waiting for questions. The crowd erupted with shouts, but Jalen had already turned, his team shielding him as they descended the stairs. Back in the courthouse, Royce remained in a small consultation room, his suit rumpled and tie loosened. "Can we change the plea?" he asked his lawyer, voice breaking. "I'll admit it all." His attorney sighed, weary and bitter. "That ship sailed the minute you lied on record." "You weren't just on trial, Royce. The entire system you helped protect was." Word of Royce's conviction sent waves across the industry. Within 48 hours, 3 senior executives at Skybridge resigned. A 4th was placed under federal review. An internal investigation began rolling across all branches, starting with pilot oversight and crew conduct training. Several other past passenger complaints, once buried, resurfaced into public light. Meanwhile, Emmerich Dole, the technician who had risked everything to reveal Royce's falsified reports, entered federal witness protection under a new identity. His actions had not only cracked open the case, but prompted a broader look into airline compliance manipulation. Behind the scenes, he was being consulted by ethics boards to help reform whistleblower protection policies in the aviation industry. And Lionel Kerr, the passenger who'd stood up on that flight with only his conscience to guide him, was awarded the National Ethics Medal for Civic Courage in a quiet ceremony. "I just did what I knew was right," he told reporters. But to millions watching, he had become the symbol of civilian bravery in the face of systemic indifference. Back in his office later that night, Jalen sat alone, reviewing proposals from lawmakers who now sought to introduce a Flight Integrity Act, aimed at safeguarding passengers' rights and increasing cockpit accountability. The stack of documents was thick, but Jalen didn't feel overwhelmed. He felt focused, purposeful. His fingers still ached, and his hand was still healing, but something deeper had been set right. Not fully, but meaningfully. One man's broken hand had revealed a system more fractured than anyone imagined. Months had passed since the courtroom had erupted with the final verdict, but the memory of it still clung to Jalen like a shadow that refused to let go. The cameras were gone, the headlines had faded, but the weight of everything that had happened still pressed on his shoulders. His hand, though mostly healed, ached whenever he clenched it too tight, an echo of the violence that had started it all. But pain, Jalen had learned, could be useful. It sharpened his focus. It reminded him of the work still to be done. He sat alone in a quiet conference room at Kaimark's Technologies, the same room where he had once brokered billion-dollar deals and outlined cybersecurity protocols for high-level clients. Now, the room was silent, stripped of screens and charts, save for a single manila folder resting on the table before him, labeled Skygate Initiative, Federal Compliance Reform, Phase 2. He exhaled, steady and deep, and ran his uninjured hand over the folder's cover. This wasn't a tech pitch. It was a blueprint for something larger. By morning, his official resignation as CEO would go public. Not permanent, just indefinite. But the board would manage, and his deputy, Marcus Vey, had been well prepared to take over. Jalen's focus had shifted. The Skygate Initiative, a project born from pain, was now his mission. What began as a task force to examine flight crew misconduct had exploded into a nationwide movement. Backed by watchdog groups, civil rights alliances, and even a few retired pilots who had watched Royce's trial with clenched jaws, the initiative had become more than Jalen had imagined. He traveled constantly now, lecturing at universities about institutional accountability, consulting with federal aviation auditors on hidden biases in airline policy, and speaking at congressional subcommittees with chilling clarity. His voice wasn't just heard, it was trusted. Every time he stood behind a podium, staring out at young cadets or stone-faced lawmakers, he thought of that moment on Flight B-247, Royce's grip crushing his fingers, the humiliation, the silence of the cabin. It all returned like a storm in his chest, and yet he turned that rage into resolve. Still, the consequences rippled. Skybridge Air, desperate to restore its public image, had begun restructuring, but the damage was done. Shareholders pulled out. Old cases resurfaced. The Department of Civil Aviation subpoenaed them for previously closed discrimination complaints, cases they had dismissed or ignored entirely. Some involved flight attendants with long disciplinary records. Others, chillingly, were linked to Royce himself. A hidden culture had been unearthed, and now it stood blinking in the harsh light of public scrutiny. Royce Denlin, the man whose hands had once twisted Jalen's bones, was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison without parole. His aviation license revoked, his name blacklisted from commercial airspace. The courtroom had been thick with tension during sentencing. Jalen hadn't attended, choosing instead to hold a private meeting with his team at the initiative's headquarters in D.C. But a message had come through that afternoon. Royce, through his attorney, had requested a private conversation before beginning his sentence. The offer was clear. 1 hour, no press, just the two of them. Jalen didn't hesitate. "No," he said simply, his voice unwavering. Orion Graves, seated across from him, tilted his head. "You sure?" Could be leverage. Jalen stared out the window of the office, the city glowing beneath a pale dusk. Some lessons must be learned in silence. The days that followed brought validation and more responsibility. The FAA unveiled a new mandate for real-time auditing of cabin behavior during flights. Planes would now carry encrypted surveillance accessible only to a secure third-party oversight committee, a committee that Jalen's task force would help assemble. No more hidden acts, no more unanswered complaints. The very sky was shifting, but change came with resistance. Airline lobbyists pushed back, calling it government overreach. Internal memos from rival carriers mocked the new policies as optics theater. Yet the public support was undeniable. Passengers now understood that invisible systems had allowed visible harm. And Jalen. He became the face not of vengeance, but of vision. Late one night, alone in his temporary apartment near Capitol Hill, Jalen stood on his narrow balcony and looked up. A plane passed overhead, blinking lights slicing through the humid air. He followed it with his eyes, not in fear, not in anger, but in memory. He whispered a quiet truth to himself, one that he had earned the right to say. The skies had never been so watched, and never so ready for change. Jalen stepped into the federal conference room and felt the weight of every eye. No applause, no welcome speech, just silence, as if the room itself was holding its breath. The table stretched long and sharp, lined with polished metal nameplates and the stern faces of generals, senators, directors, and federal agency leads. The seal of the United States Compliance Bureau was etched into the glass wall behind them, glowing faintly beneath soft lighting. The air was cold, but not from temperature. This cold came from scrutiny. And Jalen Thorne, once a passenger in seat 1A, now sat at the head of this table as its appointed chair. He didn't wait for permission. "I don't speak from theory," Jalen began, his voice calm but unshakable. "I speak from what it feels like to bleed quietly in a first-class seat while people pretend not to see." The silence broke. Some leaned forward, some looked away, others scribbled notes. But none dismissed him. A man in a gray military uniform, General Clark, cleared his throat but didn't interrupt. He didn't have to. The statement had done its work. Jalen took his seat slowly, resting his hand, still stiff on cold mornings, on the surface of the polished table. Across from him, Director Marin of the Civil Aviation Oversight Division blinked hard. "Mr. Thorne," he began, attempting diplomacy, "we understand your experience was unacceptable, but it is essential that our proposals here remain objective and data-driven." "I agree," Jalen said smoothly, "which is why I've come with data. Real accounts, documented testimonies, leaked memos, anonymous surveys, and more than a dozen reports from passengers like me, men who never raised their voices but were forced to lower their dignity." He reached for a leather folio, sliding it across the table toward the group. Inside, an early draft of the Passenger Equity Rating System, PERS, outlined a digital framework for real-time anonymous flight crew evaluations that would be linked to federal performance monitoring. It wasn't just feedback, it was oversight with teeth. One of the senators scoffed. "You're proposing crowdsourced surveillance." "No," Jalen said firmly, leaning in. "I'm proposing accountability. If a man with a uniform can bend your fingers until they snap and lie about it in a report, then your standards aren't standards, they're performances, and passengers are the ones paying to watch the show." The senator grew quiet. The debate raged for hours. Concerns about privacy, false accusations, airline resistance, and legal jurisdiction were thrown at Jalen like darts. But he didn't flinch. Every argument had been expected. Every question had a reply grounded in fact and lived experience. But it wasn't just what he said, it was how he said it. His posture never shifted into arrogance. His tone never rose in anger. It was the slow burn of a man who'd walked through fire and returned with blueprints. During a short recess, Jalen stepped out onto the building's rooftop terrace, needing a moment to breathe. The city skyline spread out before him like a waiting chessboard. A junior staffer approached, Elric Tan, no older than 25, carrying a clipboard and nervous energy. "Sir," Elric said, clearing his throat, "just wanted to say, what you said in there, people needed to hear it." Jalen nodded, then paused. "Do they, though? Or do they just need to be unable to ignore it?" Elric hesitated, then gave a small, respectful bow of his head and walked away. Alone again, Jalen stared at the horizon. The skies had once betrayed him. Now they were his responsibility. Back in the room, the final votes came in. The board had approved the framework. Barely. Just enough to push PERS into pilot phase. Airlines, predictably, resisted. Within weeks, 3 major carriers lobbied against the initiative, calling it unwarranted and divisive. But when flight staff at one of those airlines were flagged in rapid succession by the new anonymous reports, and a corroborating leaked video showed clear abuse, the tides turned. Jalen didn't celebrate. He noted the win, documented it, and kept building. He visited universities, sat with legal ethicists, even consulted with airline unions. The goal was never revenge. It was reform. Quiet, lasting, systemic reform. On the one-year review of the program, a public report was issued showing a 28% drop in mid-flight passenger complaints and a notable uptick in satisfaction for minority travelers. The system was working. Not perfectly, but undeniably. Jalen stood at the press briefing that day, flanked by federal staff and independent watchdog leaders. His tone remained humble. "This isn't about punishing bad people," he said. "It's about making sure the ones who still think they can hide realize they can't." Later, as reporters packed up and the lights dimmed, a colleague approached him, a man named Darius Penn, an ethics consultant and one of the few who had privately doubted the program from the start. "You didn't make yourself a hero," Darius said quietly. "You made yourself a mirror." Jalen didn't respond immediately. He looked out at the lobby where passengers checked into flights, unaware of the changes now watching over them. Then he turned back. "If they didn't want to look," Jalen said, his voice barely more than a whisper, "he'd make it impossible to look away." The room went still as Jalen Thorne stepped onto the raised platform at Kaimarx Technologies' downtown campus. The event was modest by design. No flashing lights, no corporate anthem, just a row of developers, engineers, and executives seated beneath a blue banner that read, "Project Vantis, Integrity in Every Line." Jalen's hand, once broken, now rested firmly on the podium. His fingers, though fully healed, bore faint surgical marks, a quiet reminder of the storm he'd survived. He didn't wait for applause to die down. "We didn't build this suite to impress the market," Jalen began, his voice calm but commanding. "We built it because we now know what happens when trust fails, at 30,000 feet, or anywhere else." His eyes swept across the crowd, pausing briefly on the interns seated in the back row. Many of them had joined Kaimarx after the trial, drawn by his story and by his resolve. The encryption suite he unveiled that day wasn't just another upgrade, it was a direct result of the flight incident, redesigned to prioritize ethical traceability, secure compliance logs, and immutable evidence streams. Every line of code had been rechecked, rewritten, and refortified. Internally, they called it code without shadows. Government agencies moved fast. Within weeks, procurement letters from the Department of Civic Infrastructure and the Federal Integrity Bureau started arriving. Kaimarx had gone from a promising innovator to a national safeguard almost overnight. But with the surge in contracts came resistance, not from within, but from outside. A rival firm, Takeoff Systems, launched a quiet but strategic attack. Anonymous sources claimed Jalen was profiting off pity, that he had built the Skygate initiative not for change, but as a branding tool. One article quoted a senior insider suggesting that Jalen's nonprofit was just a soft shell for political influence. The media pounced, hungry for a counter-narrative. For a moment, the air around Kaimarx thickened with suspicion. Jalen did not respond immediately. He didn't call a press conference. He didn't post on social media. He went silent. It was Orion Graves who stepped into the light. At a surprise press briefing, he dropped a quiet bomb. Leaked internal emails from Takeoff executives mocking the flight incident as minor drama and joking about milking the court pity wave if anything similar ever happened to them. The backlash was instant. Investors pulled funding from Takeoff. Their CEO issued a stuttering apology no one believed. The very narrative they tried to weaponize had become their undoing. At Kaimarx, tension gave way to resilience. Inside the operations hub, young developers worked overtime, not out of fear, but pride. A fresh energy swept through the campus. The Skygate initiative, initially just a small compliance watchdog, saw its donations spike and applications from civic engineers and legal analysts double within days. They were no longer responding to a crisis. They were building a movement. One rainy afternoon, Jalen gathered a small group of interns in a private conference room. They had asked to meet with him, wanting to understand the real journey, not the headlines. Jalen entered quietly, carrying a coffee he barely sipped. An intern named Dev leaned forward, nervous but sincere. "How did you stay composed when they tried to humiliate you? Not just on that plane, but afterward too." Jalen looked at him for a moment before answering. His voice was steady, almost soft. "You don't fight back just to win. You fight back to show that dignity doesn't require a crowd." He stood, walking toward the whiteboard, where someone had drawn diagrams of the encryption interface. "Do you know the best part about integrity?" he asked, turning back to them. "It works even when no one's watching. That's what we built. Not code that hides things, but code that remembers." They were silent, absorbing it. Outside, thunder rolled softly. He tapped the board once, then turned back to the group. "And as for revenge," he said with the faintest trace of a smile, "the best revenge is proving that dignity doesn't need a spotlight. It just needs to hold the line." The chill in the terminal was sharper than he remembered. Jalen Thorne stepped off the tram and into Concourse C of the Caraway National Aviation Center, his polished shoes clicking against the buffed tile floor. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause to take it all in. Instead, he moved forward, past security, past the newsstand he remembered from that morning a year ago, and down the long glass corridor that opened toward Gate 4B, The very gate where everything had changed, where pain had met power, where silence was shattered. He could feel it, the dull ache in his right hand returning as if summoned by memory alone. Though the bones had healed, the nerves flared in cold weather, a quiet reminder of how far dignity had to stretch to make itself heard. He flexed his fingers absently, trying to shake off the tightness. The pain didn't worry him. He welcomed it. It made things real. The concourse looked different, not in structure, but in presence. The staff uniforms had changed, bolder colors, clearer name tags, and more diversity among the faces. Security guards now wore discreet body cams. Gate agents greeted each passenger with deliberate warmth. It was rehearsed, yes, but genuine enough to feel earned. As he approached Gate 4B, a temporary lectern had been set up beside a bronze sheet covered by a velvet drape. Folding chairs filled the waiting area. About 100 men in crisp pilot uniforms, mostly trainees, sat in perfect rows. At the front, 3 men stood together. Lionel Kerr, tall and composed in a navy sweater and jeans, a man known only by his alias now, once Emmerich Dole, in dark glasses and a nondescript windbreaker, and Chief Coordinator Morris Lenroy, who had invited Jalen to speak. "Mr. Thorne," Morris said, stepping forward to shake his hand with solemn respect. "We're honored. Truly." Jalen nodded, his voice low. "Let's keep it about the work, not me." Morris smiled. "Of course." Jalen stepped up to the lectern without introduction. The pilots quieted immediately. The fluorescent lights above flickered once, then steadied. A soft humming filled the space, ventilation, or maybe tension. Jalen gripped the edges of the stand and scanned the room. "No speech today," he began, his tone even. "No headlines, just a memory and a lesson." He paused, letting the silence settle. "1 year ago, at this very gate, I was treated as less than what I was, not because of who I am, but because someone thought he could get away with it. He didn't name Royce. He didn't have to. I sat in that seat over there," he pointed calmly, "and I watched how fast silence forms around injustice, how quickly people look away when decency costs them nothing." He glanced at the seated pilots, young, alert, faces etched with a mix of admiration and discomfort. Good. They needed to feel both. "But then I saw something else," Jalen continued. "A man from the back of the plane stood up. A technician held the truth even when told to erase it. And people, ordinary people, chose not to forget." His eyes flicked briefly to Lionel and Emmerich, both of whom nodded with quiet pride. Jalen took a breath and pulled the velvet cloth away from the bronze plaque. The metal gleamed under the terminal lights. In bold, etched letters, the words stared back at the room. "This space honors those who refuse to be quieted at 30,000 feet." No one clapped. No one moved. And that was exactly right. Jalen didn't linger. He stepped down, walking slowly past the rows of pilots, his footsteps echoing with the weight of everything unsaid. A few of them nodded respectfully. One man stood as if to say something but hesitated, then simply watched him go. Outside the terminal windows, a plane taxied slowly into view. The tail bore the new Skybridge livery, silver, not blue, with a thin gold stripe beneath. Cosmetic, but maybe it meant someone somewhere was still trying. As Jalen reached the far end of the concourse, he looked over his shoulder one last time. Lionel was speaking softly with 2 trainees. Emmerich had already slipped away. Morris stood alone, looking at the plaque. The air still smelled the same, caffeinated, metallic, sterile. But something in it had changed. Not the atmosphere, the intent. Jalen exhaled, rubbing his hand again. Then he whispered, mostly to himself, "Sometimes," he said softly, "a broken hand heals straighter than the one that never bent." The envelope was already on the floor when Jalen opened the door. It must have slipped from the mail slot, resting quietly on the hardwood like a message too heavy to stay upright. He bent down to pick it up, noting the plain white exterior, unmarked except for a faint postmark, Calverton Federal Facility. No return address, no name, just the kind of silence that didn't need an introduction. His fingers hesitated at the flap. Something about it felt heavier than paper, heavier than ink. With a slow breath, he tore it open. Inside, one sentence. "You were right. I never saw you as human until the world saw me for what I was." Jalen read the line once, then again, his eyes tracing each letter like a scar. The handwriting was jagged, inconsistent, clearly written by someone unsteady or unpracticed, maybe even ashamed. The pen had pressed deep into the page, as if the writer was trying to force something out of himself he'd never said aloud. He didn't need to guess. He knew who it was from. The paper trembled slightly in his hand, not from fear, but from restraint. He didn't speak. There was no one to speak to. Just the quiet murmur of the evening city rising up through the window like distant applause or far-off thunder. He folded the letter once, carefully, and slid it into the drawer beside his desk without another glance. He didn't need closure, but it had come anyway. By nightfall, Jalen found himself on the balcony, a place he hadn't sat for more than a few minutes in the past year. The air was cool, brushing softly against his skin, just cold enough to remind him of the day it all began. He leaned back in the chair, one hand resting on the armrest, the other tucked gently in his lap where the ache still whispered through his fingers when the temperature dipped. That pain had never quite left. Some part of him hoped it never would. Above him, planes blinked across the sky, red, green, white, silent messengers slipping between stars. He watched them like memories, each one carrying someone forward while he sat still, not stuck but anchored. And for the first time in months, maybe longer, he didn't feel like he was bracing for the next hit. He just breathed. The city below flickered with amber lights, horns in the distance, the rumble of a train. Somewhere across town, someone would be boarding a plane, unaware of the systems now watching, protecting, measuring, unaware that someone had bled to make those systems better. Jalen shifted his gaze to the sky again. He thought about Royce Denlin, not the man who snapped his fingers, but the man who had written that letter. A man who had spent every moment of the trial defiant, calculating, cruel. And yet, here was this scrap of remorse, dropped like a stone in the ocean. Would it make a difference? Would it heal anything? Maybe not. But maybe it wasn't about healing for Royce. Maybe it was about admitting, if only once, that the story didn't unfold the way he had hoped, and that the mirror he spent his life avoiding had finally caught up to him. Jalen didn't smile. He didn't cry. He just stared at the stars, their light distant but unyielding. And in that moment, there were no speeches, no statements, no reporters, just the sky, and the man who had learned to stand beneath it, head high. He let his shoulders drop, the tension bleeding out with the breeze. This wasn't peace, not fully. The world was still the world, but for now, in this quiet, he felt something close to it, something like stillness, something like strength without needing to fight for it. And above the clouds, where injustice once soared, something better now learned how to fly. They thought they could get away with it, but the FAA was watching. If you stand for strength, justice, and accountability, hit subscribe and join the channel. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It examines the violent misuse of authority, racial bias, and the targeting of black professionals, even in elite spaces. By depicting this shocking abuse, it challenges viewers to reflect on power dynamics and systemic discrimination. Its purpose is to raise awareness, provoke critical thought, and inspire action toward justice, dignity, and institutional accountability.